The United States has been in many wars, but do you ever stop and think what the cost of all the conflict is? What has been gained and what has been lost? Today, I'm going to be listing down the top 10 most significant wars in U.S. history. I'm keeping three main factors: casualties, brutality, and historical influence. Number 10, the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan began as a result of the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. 4 weeks later, President Bush announced that he had authorized combat operations in Afghanistan.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
American and British forces intensely bombed Afghanistan's key cities to the Taliban regime, who they blamed for the 9/11 attacks. Even after killing bin Laden and replacing the Taliban government of Afghanistan, the U.S. fought them for another 2 decades before eventually signing a peace deal in 2020. The war cost over 2,300 American lives and another 20,000 wounded. Okay, when I originally wrote this script, the end of the war thing had not happened yet, and the war in Afghanistan has officially ended in a Taliban victory. On the 15th of August 2021, the Taliban officially marched into Kabul, the Afghani capital, and toppled the U.S.-backed Afghanistan government. The U.S. responded by exiting all remaining troops from Afghanistan in a pretty chaotic evacuation.
All right, stand by for shot.
Stand by for shot.
Number 9, the Spanish-American War. In 1898, when the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, Cuba, the United States blamed the Spanish for the event. In reality, the USS Maine explosion was most likely an accident on the American crew's part. Even so, the U.S. is looking for a way to acquire Cuba as a state. The reason this war makes the list over other wars is the brutality of combat. It was a transition war from the old way of fighting wars to the new way of using mechanized machine guns and better firearms. The war initially began halfway across the world in the Philippines, which, at the time, was a Spanish colony. After the Battle of Manila Bay, the Philippines was invaded by the U.S. In Cuba, fighting was much more intense, as future President Teddy Roosevelt led his Rough Riders into numerous battles. Over 2,400 Americans died for islands that the Americans would later give up. Number 8, the American Revolutionary War. The American Revolution began when colonists were outraged about the way the British Empire had treated them. The war lasted for 8 years and eventually ended in a U.S. victory. Without the American Revolution, there would be no America, the French monarchy would still be intact, and Britain would have inevitably invaded the rest of the Americas. Such names as Samuel Adams, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington were key people in the war. Over 600,000 soldiers died in the war, and even more civilians. Number 7. The Iraq War. On March 20th, 2003, President Bush informed the U.S. that the United States was at war with Iraq.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Convincing the country that Iraq was in possession of weapons of mass destruction, Bush sent coalition forces to invade Iraq in 2003. Even after Saddam was captured and the U.S. was caught in the middle of conflict between terror groups, soldiers were not used to urban combat many battles offered. Many citizens also believed the war was not worth U.S. resources and lives.
don't want to run across that fucking window anymore.
Huh?
I don't want to run across that window anymore.
That's a long distance. That's short distance right for us.
Significant battles, such as the Second Battle of Fallujah, shaped public opinion on the war towards negativity. The 8-year conflict killed 4,486 Americans and was the bloodiest U.S. war of the 21st century. Number 6. The Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War was fought for the large West, which for decades had been controlled by Mexico. America was looking to expand west as they wanted a coast-to-coast nation. When American troops annexed Texas and marched into disputed Mexico, there was no question that war had broken out. Mexico was a formidable opponent, but they were no match for the cunning and witty generals that the U.S. had at their disposal. The Mexican-American War is remembered not only for the 13,000 dead, but also for the innovation and wide use of more modern tactics. Number 5. The Korean War. After World War II, the Korean Peninsula was divided on the 38th parallel, and two governments were set up, the Northern Communist Government and the Southern Democratic Government. When the Communist North Koreans invaded the Democratic South Koreans, a coalition was formed to protect South Korea. The United States, United Kingdom, Canada, and many other nations such as Belgium, Australia, France, and the Philippines helped defend Korea from total annihilation.
In Korea, United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists. An advance whose purpose, General Ridgway states, is not to seize ground, but to wipe out the enemy. The Chinese Red Army, fighting desperately in small isolated stands, prefers to give ground on wider fronts rather than join battle. And it's up to the infantry to clear out the pockets of die-hard communists. With the enemy falling back to the Han River, United Nations commanders had expected that the Reds would make their stand there. But under a steady, withering barrage, GIs are able to cross the river and establish a beachhead. Within 2 hours, a pontoon bridge spans the Han, and United Nations troops and equipment pour across toward the capital city of Seoul.
The Korean War took a drastic turn when the Chinese joined the war, causing the death toll to rise by the thousands. In total, over 36,000 Americans died alone in the Korean War, not including other allies. Number 4. The Vietnam War. In 1964, America decided that they could no longer sit by and watch as a communist regime engulfed Vietnam. The draft was reinstated and soldiers began shipping out to Vietnam. The war was brutal, and intense guerrilla fighting of the Viet Cong only added to the brutality. The harsh jungle terrain forced the U.S. to innovate with tactics. Many types of new weapons, such as Agent Orange, were used in the war. The U.S. was also not ready for the guerrilla warfare the Viet Cong employed, such as confusion on the battlefield. In the end, President Nixon ended the war, and American troops officially ended their involvement in 1973. America's most controversial war, the Vietnam War, is responsible for over 58,000 American deaths and still has an effect on American culture today. Number 3. World War I.
Listen to your sergeant! If anybody turns back, if any one of our boys comes running towards you, you take this rifle and you shoot them dead. Do you understand? Do you understand me? Do you understand what I'm telling you, son? You take this rifle, you shoot them dead.
The Great War was the first war where modern weapons were used on a grand scale. As a result, many soldiers were killed by ignorant strategy and incompetent generals. This advent of trench warfare caused many soldiers to die of disease in the unclean, muggy trenches soldiers were forced to reside in. Many soldiers were killed by artillery, which was the biggest non-disease killer of the war. Even though America joined towards the latter half of the war, the Central Powers still managed to inflict a heavy death toll on them. In total, 116,556 Americans died in the war. They were president for barely a year. Number 2, World War II.
Clear the ramp! 30 seconds! Got me with you!
Port side stick, starboard side stick. Move fast and clear those murder holes.
Want to see plenty of beats between men. 5 men is a juicy opportunity. 1 man's a waste of ammo.
Stand out of your weapons. Keep those actions clear. I'll see you on the beach.
A war that needs no introduction, World War II was the deadliest war in human history, killing over 75 million people. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Britain and France declared war, officially marking the start of World War II. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. officially declared war on the Axis. The Pacific Theater was the harshest fighting for the Americans. The Japanese were ruthless and would do anything to protect the small islands they held. Conflict between world superpowers was destined to kill many, but the Allies ultimately reigned victorious over the battered down Axis. Some of the deadliest battles include D-Day, Iwo Jima, and the Battle of the Bulge. Over 400,000 Americans died in World War II. Number 1, the Civil War.
Stay here! Must be someone's a little more useful. Gentlemen, what do you say we charge those guns?
I don't know, gentlemen. I bet that sounds a bit dangerous.
John Wise, that was what I was suggesting. I was just being subtle. No sense in dying if we can't figure out who takes the credit, right? Sir, battalion is ready to attack. We don't have further orders. Sir, I don't suspect we'll get further orders. The cadets are ready to charge, sir. I suggest we attack and take those guns before we get blown apart. Vicksburg! Vicksburg denied!
The Civil War is the deadliest American war in history because only Americans did die. It had drastic consequences for the United States of America. The new inventions of new artillery and better firearms meant that both sides were able to employ them in battle. Ironclads also played a role as they killed many naval men at sea. Many people died, and the United States would take decades to truly recover from the millions lost in the war. Commanders like General Grant and Stonewall Jackson went down in history as great military leaders of our time. 750,000 Americans died during the Civil War and left repercussions and economic problems we still face today. Even though slavery was abolished and the war left behind drastic consequences and rebuilding and debt to the American people.